want to talk quickly about security for the have-nots. Well, a little bit about the who am I and why does this matter. This is my agenda. I'll quickly talk. I work for a company called IONS, Institute for Applied Network Security. They're like a decision support company. We're a lot of faculty analysts. Joff, you're on faculty as well, right? Are you? No? Yeah, you're on faculty, right? So a bunch of yeah. So I see another Matt. Matt's on faculty, right? So there's a lot of security folks on faculty there, and they provide security services for what I like to call the haves. The people that can pay for decision support, the people that have, I don't want to call that unlimited budgets, but let's call it very large budgets relative to everybody else. And what's really interesting is that as I talk to folks on the road a lot in small, medium businesses, SMBs, right? By the way, when you see SMB in this presentation, it does not mean server message block, right? It means small, medium business. SME meaning small, medium enterprise, so kind of that next level up, that 1,000 to 2,500 employees. But when you see a lot of security folks that are offering best practices to a lot of these small, medium businesses, they literally might as well be handing you the repair manual for a Formula One car and saying, okay, now you're part of the pit crew. It's ridiculous, right? Now, again, if you happen to be in that secondary category, the have-nots, right, where you don't have the kind of budget to implement this stuff, this is who the talk is for, right? So anyway, who is this talk for? Yeah, exactly that. I'm looking for, or effectively publishing the talk for folks that don't have full-time security folks, right? You may be, or maybe you're the only security person at an organization, and you're in charge of everything security. When I talk to folks particularly at some larger events, right, where folks typically that are coming to these events have just these ginormous budgets, they like to talk about how, well, no, nobody deals with something like this. And I want to start quickly with mentioning that I'm working an incident, or I'm just wrapping up an incident with a regulated data industry provider. I guess I can just say healthcare. We'll just go there. Healthcare provider, about 2,500 employees, 50 plus locations. How many security staff do they have? Anybody want to shoot? Ooh, I see some ones, I see some fives, I see some zero. But that's okay, because security is everyone's job. IT is I heard the laughter already, right? IT is taking care of security. By the way, how many IT staff do they have for 2,500 employees? No, it's better than one, right? We'll call it less than 10, right? So I'm not going to give the exact number, but less than 10. So now we're talking regulated data industry, no security, dozens of locations, right? 50 plus locations, 2,500 employees, right? Wow, right? That's the reality. That's not an outlier. That's not an outlier, right? That's the reality. This is who this talk is for. Now, if you happen to not be in this situation, hopefully you can still take some stuff away from the talk, right? But less Hacking Dave or somebody else is talking somewhere else where you want to get into some deep tech, now is the time to bail. Okay, real quick, the have and the have-nots. Folks, it all comes down to the Benjamins, right? I'm going to channel my inner Diddy, right? It's all about the Benjamins. Small businesses don't have money. It's not that they don't care about security. The choice literally comes down to when a consultant comes in and says, hey, you need to go deploy X, you need to go deploy Y. It literally comes down to, can we make that a business expansion, or are we doing this one cybersecurity thing that, let's be real, probably isn't going to measurably change their security overall? If I asked all of the experienced security analysts or security engineers or whatever we call ourselves in the room here, what's the number one priority, your number one priority for security, I'm going to get at least a dozen different answers. And I want you to remember that these small, medium businesses and these SMEs, they can afford to do, at best, maybe one of those. And so the reality here is that without holistic security, right, deep diving into these really aren't going to work very well. So one of my favorite, by the way, is when we get into a security, security organization with security consult with a small, medium business, And I hear that, 2 years prior, a security consultant came in and they said, you know what you need? You need a formal risk assessment. And they blew their entire budget on a risk assessment where they're told about all of these problems that they can't possibly tackle. They're offered solutions and, SALs, and to, no joke, had a real world situation where a company that was driving home about 7 million in revenue, forget profit, just 7 million in revenue, was handed a SAL after a $25,000 risk assessment. They're handed a statement of work for $500,000. $500,000 to correct their security issues. This is absolutely delusional. If you are a consultant doing this, shame on you. All right, shame on you. First and foremost, when you work with a small, medium business or small, medium enterprise, you have to be realistic about what's achievable and what isn't. When everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. I used to be a medic way back in the day. We would go to, we'd have to do these hospital rotations. And I remember doing hospital rotations at this one military base, the emergency room, as I'm sure you can imagine. Everything that goes through there, all the labs, they're stat, right? If you haven't heard or watched DR, stat means do it right now. Do it fast. You're the priority. When I first checked in there, they're like, make sure and mark all the labs double stat. I'm like, I'm sorry, what? And like, double stat. And I'm like, no, I don't know what double stat means. And it turns out they had a problem there where everybody was special. The ICU labs had to be stat as well, and so did the cardiac care unit, and then the step-down unit, and then nobody was a priority. About 2 years into working at this hospital, doing rotations in the hospital, I come in for my quarterly rotation, and they're like, hey, make sure and mark all the labs. I'm like, I got it, double stat. And they're like, triple stat. Folks, when you try to prioritize everything, you prioritize nothing. Now, they were able to game the system there. We can't, right? The reality is SMB security looks way too much like this, which, as horrifying as it is not nearly as horrifying as most SMB security. Next thing is about best practices, because my friends, best practices are absolutely situational. You need to make sure and apply them to your specific circumstances, right? Again, if you are a consultant, be very, very careful about this. So, I want to talk quickly about build or buy. This is something that we have constant discussions about, particularly again with SMBs and SMEs, because they don't have a ton of budget for these nice, shiny, we used to call them blinking boxing. I believe that was a Jeff McJunkin term, if I recall correctly. But we had this theory that if we went to RSA, right, and we sat down at one of the vendor booths, and we produced one of those nice hardware appliances that was just covered, the whole front was covered with LEDs, that CISOs would definitely want to buy it. That their value proposition was being measured in the number of blinking LEDs on the front of the box, because as you know, that's what keeps you secure, right? But laying all joking aside, SMBs don't have money for those, right? They don't have money for those. And so very often, they're pointed to open source solutions, open source security. And by the way, there's a ton of awesome open source stuff. I'm actually going to recommend a little bit of it in the talk here. But be very clear about open source is not free. Open source is only free when your time has no value. Unfortunately, and I'm going to come back to this circumstance here with the 2,500 employees and less than 10 system administrators, or less than 10 total in IT, I guess, might be the better way to say it. That counts the help desk too, by the way, right? Total IT. There's only 2,080 work hours in a year. That's measured on 40-hour weeks with no vacation, no conference time, no continuing education, no anything else. And so you have to be very clear that when you are choosing to implement an open source solution, you are actively choosing not to do something else. And that other thing may well have been a higher priority. And so one of the things that I coach small business stakeholders on, heck, I coach all my stakeholders on this, but small business in particular, is be very methodical about where build versus buy makes sense. Oftentimes, right, you go buy where, not necessarily where it's the most impactful for your organization, but where it frees up the most time so that you can go implement other solutions, right? Again, this effectively is an old high school algebra problem of solve for X, right? X is on the left side of our equation. That means maximizing security given our constraints. And on the right side of the equation are, well, our constraints. Primarily here we're talking about time and budget. Far too often, though, I lose this battle. And we've got that smart system administrator, that really, really smart system admin who's like, no, bro, I've got it. Which is awesome when they have it, right? The problem is they're a one-man or one-woman show. And when they leave an organization, oh my gosh, does it hurt. I was working with, coming back to or out of the SMB and SME space, I was working with a large financial services client sitting in the Fortune 250 who almost was crippled by losing a single engineer who built a huge portion of their infrastructure and, well, a huge portion of gluing their infrastructure together. Independently, it all worked. It just didn't work together. And so you start looking at the, a lot of times folks refer to this as kind of the key man problem or key person problem. Unfortunately, in an SMB or an SME, when we start getting into security and IT, that key person is everybody. When you have fewer people, losing any one of those individuals and having to rotate them out, it causes a disproportionate response or disproportionate impact. Now, as we get into some discussions here, I want to be very clear about threat models. Your threat model is your threat model. It's not my threat model. It's not anybody else's threat model. You have to keep in mind, I'm talking here typically about SMB and SME threat models. I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of hate about this, where I offer some recommendation that flies in the face of some other, some other recommendations others have given, or quote unquote best practices, right? Which again are situational. Again, if you look at these recommendations, they aren't for you, then they aren't for you, period. Right? I'm also going to probably tick off some vendors, right? And so you can imagine that there will probably be some vendor tiers here. You know, when I talk about the fact that as a small, medium business, you absolutely should not be paying for security awareness training. Go to freaking YouTube. You do not need to pay for a professionally put together video where some yahoo for phishing training, where some yahoo jumps out of a van looking like they're all decked out like Delta Force, right? Or some other high production value explosions or what have you. When the reality is that your people are going to click on stuff anyway. Oh, by the way, as we get into phishing assessments, right? Yeah. Oh, by the way, these are all AI generated, right? So if you're noticing, I intentionally left some of the extra hands, and I picked stuff, by the way, and you'll notice some extra hands and extra arms and what have you in here. So I kept some of the funnier AI. I saw somebody kind of pointing out some of the AI notes there. But, phishing testing, again, great for large organizations. Okay, questionable value for large organizations, because let's be real, right? Zero value. Phishing simulations offer zero value for SMBs. How many folks, even at large organizations with huge security budgets, think you can get click-through rates to zero? Anyone? Nope. I think you were delusional if you were raising your hand. I wouldn't think. You would be delusional if you were raising your hand. Or just uninformed. Excuse me. It's possible. But an SMB, come on, man. We're definitely not getting there. And so if we're not getting to zero, what are we doing spending our extremely limited budget on phishing assessments, right? So the reality here is I will probably annoy some vendors. I'll probably annoy some government agencies and what have you. Speaking of government agencies, let's look at the FCC. The FCC offers a number of recommendations for SMBs and some of their security considerations. This is their 10-step plan. By the way, I am intentionally not going into CISA's guidance for SMBs, because as much as I love CISA, and I think they do an outstanding job and they have an absolutely thankless mission, be very real about that. They have an absolutely thankless mission. Most of their advice is simply not actionable. Their SMB advice is simply not actionable by SMBs. I had to go down market to find something that wasn't just laughable, and I say down market to the FCC. And notice here in their top 10, they want you to create a mobile device action plan. And this really involves you installing MDM so that you can do remote wipe as you dive into the details around this. So having a plan for lost and stolen mobile devices. Folks, I'm working with Fortune 500s that are still dealing with BYOD and no MDM. You tell me how an SMB is going to implement this, right? Okay, let's drop out of government. Let's look at what commercial services are offering. Yeah, Kaspersky, they can't even narrow it down to 10. They've got 15. I know there's no love lost in the room for Kaspersky, but look, they actually have an SMB action plan, right? And so it's 15 steps and carry out risk assessments. Okay, cool. We already talked about that, right? Now, if you want to do an internal risk assessment, they are fantastic, and this is a great spot where you can get good resources from CISA, right? Do that internally. Do not pay a consultant as an SMB to do your risk assessment. By the way, I'm not saying don't ever pay a consultant for risk assessment. There are great reasons to do that. If you're a small, medium business, don't blow your budget on that part. Keep your software updated. Well, thank goodness that's in the list, because patching is easy, right? Who knew prior to now? Encrypt key information? Are you kidding me? Right? Again, I'm working with very large organizations that don't have encryption plans set up. But this last one's my favorite. Ensure third parties who deal with you are also secure. Because this sounds to me like you're asking me to create a third-party risk management program as an SMB, right? When I can't even figure out how to keep my own devices patched. Who the is this for, right? Who were they targeting with this? Anyway, so a couple of days ago, I was just tweeted out kind of a diatribe, if you will, on best practices are not best practices, particularly when you have less resources, and it really struck a chord. And then I'm like, hey, if you want to be featured in the presentation, reply with some of the worst security advice that you've heard given to small businesses. And folks, my Twitter followers, or now ex-followers, or whatever the heck we're calling Felon Cusk and whatever. Anyway, alas, did not disappoint. And Mick, first and foremost, man, I love this, right? Don't have any, just enable audit. Anybody ever enable audit D? Yeah, I mean, look, come on, man. I'm not saying audit D is bad. In fact, I use it a lot, right? But it's not something that some random SMB system admin is going to just fire up and go to town on, right? By the way, anytime you see the word just someplace, when we're talking about technology, the person using it misunderstands the complexity of the problem, right? Okay, that's cool, right? Do zero trust just like Google. How about this? If you find yourself advising an SMB or an SME and you ever follow up with the words just like Google, leave the security industry. We're better off without you. This is another favorite of mine, right? Deploy network access control. And this is an SMB who seriously spent a ridiculous amount of money, technically SME in this case, a couple thousand employees, based on a one-off finding from a physical penetration test. Who here thinks that network admission control or network access control is the best use, or was the best use of budget for this organization's security? Anyone? No, of course not, right? I love this one too. Again, starting with just. Remove world write permissions for every file and folder on the NAS share. Folks, this right here is a resume updating event, right? Resume updating event. Implement application whitelisting in your environment. I have heard this one again and again and again, almost always prefaced with the words just. Anyone who has tried to do this knows that this is not something you just do. But my favorite one, and I'm glad that Rob calls this out as being difficult, right? Just patch. Make sure you have a vulnerability management program. Again, last week, I talked to a CISO in the Fortune 100 who was having trouble with their vulnerability management program and having trouble getting criticals patched inside of 30 days in the Fortune 1 freaking 100, right? I hear consultants offering this advice to folks with less than 100 employees. Be real about this. So, I talked about earlier, well, again, be real about what we're trying to do. We want to talk about goals. When I have very low resources, I really need to step back and think about where my focus lies. Am I trying to prevent everything? Well, first off, no, because if I prioritize everything, I prioritize nothing. Then I have to step back and say, hey, am I trying to do prevention first, or am I trying to do some combination of prevention and detection? And I'll tell you, for me, detection wins every day of the week. Because when I build 30-foot walls, I create a market for 32-foot ladders. That's just a truism, right? So let's get into recommendations. First off, deploy an EDR agent that you can afford. Notice here, I don't have any vendor recommendations, right? The one you can afford. There are EDR agents that you can afford 100% on any budget, right? Now, there are some other EDR agents that SMBs, and I'm not going to mention vendor names here, but that they definitely can't afford, right? Yeah, their licensing models might be, I don't know, abusive in that space, but deploy whatever you can afford. That's it. It's a slide, right? Let's talk about email. Folks, if you are running Exchange on-prem today, if you consult with someone running Exchange on-prem today, eliminate it. Nuke it from orbit. Nuke it from orbit. This is the number one thing, and I'll argue with any other security consultant in the room here, this is the number one thing you do today, right? You could be public IP addressing on every internal node with all of it exposed to the internet without a firewall, and I'd still tell you to move off of Exchange first, right? There is nothing else that I would do first. I want to be super clear here. I don't mean I do it. I go hire somebody that does it every day of the week. Right? Every day of the week and have them do it, because there's only a few ways to do it right and dozens or hundreds or myriad ways to get it wrong. Also, your time's more valuable. There are a few problems in security you can just buy your way out of. This conveniently happens to be one of them. So if you're working with an SMB or an SME who's still trying to do on-prem email, smack them upside the head and say, stop it. You cannot secure your network. Most SMBs that I talk to, heck, some security folks that I talk to, do not know that Microsoft has put Exchange out to pasture. Now, are we still getting patches for Exchange? Yes. Are we getting features on Exchange? Absolutely not, right? Absolutely not. There are a lot of security features that we have today in Microsoft 365 that we do not have in Exchange. By the way, if you don't like Microsoft, then move to Google Workspace. I'm agnostic here. Right? But the reality is you have to get off of Exchange, period. I want to talk about file shares too. I have this discussion all the time with CISOs. We're like, well, cloud storage, gigabyte per gigabyte is more expensive. And I'm like, no joke, right? No joke. Things you're not getting with your on-prem file storage, automatic backups, high availability, version control, protection from ransomware. Did I mention protection from ransomware? One more time, protection from ransomware. By the way, too, right, I regularly run into folks who are like, hey, don't worry, we'll just put a network-attached storage unit, a NAS unit. Before anyone was like, no, you mean SAN. No, it's small, medium business. I mean NAS. I totally do, right? That NAS, by the way, becomes its own attack surface, right? Now, I'll be the first to tell you, I've got a NAS in my home office, right, 100%. I think I've got a Synology and I've got a QNAP, and I know both of those are dirty words, and we can all sit around the bar and make jokes about those, right? I don't have exposed to the internet, by the way. That's really the key point, right? But look, at the end of the day, these are realistically additional attack surface our SMBs have to think about securing. File shares, again, move that stuff as quickly as you can, right? Move that stuff over to OneDrive or Dropbox, or pick your provider of choice and make them your file storage. This solves so many problems right out of the gate. Then DNS. You probably know about DNS over HTTPS, right? One of the things that I always recommend folks do is disable that. If you're in a business environment, disable it. I know people are going to flame war me later when they're like, Jake said to disable DNS over HTTPS. Yes, I did, 100%, right? You should know that Windows 11 has a setting now, right? And they had originally intended, by the way, for this to be the default in the release to market. But they have a setting now where all of your traffic, all of your DNS traffic, not just the browser, right, but the operating system level is filtered over TLS. You want to disable this, right? You're not engineering for privacy, which is what this is all about. You're engineering for monitoring. Now, before somebody's like, hey, Jake, SMBs don't do monitoring, I got you. We're good, right? We're going to talk about some very simple things you can do to set that up so that when you have an incident, the available data is there so that you can answer key questions like, did I lose regulated data, right? That's a really important question, as it turns out. I'm not a lawyer. This isn't legal advice, but lots of lawyers say that when you can't say we didn't lose it and you have lots of evidence that threat actors had access to it, yikes. It's an uncomfortable position to be in regardless. So once you've got this set, we need to talk about network monitoring. Yes, I know, again, most SMBs are not going to do hardcore network monitoring, but Security Onion is awesome. Notice I didn't say, by the way, go out and build your own Zeek stack, right? Nope, don't do that. By the way, if you don't know the word Zeek, that's the new rebranded bro, because bro culture is bad and all that. So Security Onion is trivial to deploy. You can not be able to spell Linux and have Security Onion up and running inside of an hour. If you can boot from an ISO, you can have Security Onion up and running. And it's dirt cheap. You can run it on inexpensive hardware. I no joke, this is not an optimal, by the way, before anybody starts throwing something at me here too, I want to clarify, this is not an optimal deployment. But for a small, medium business, about 200 people, I took one of their lifecycle workstations, right? And I don't mean workstation like engineering workstation. I mean small form factor, right? And installed Security Onion on it. And now they have somewhere in the 90-ish day retention on all of their net flow and all of the enhanced net flow that Security Onion provides. Yeah, right? This is huge. It's a huge capability they didn't have before. The cost to them was very, very minimal. Now, if you've ever dealt with Security Onion or any other network monitoring for that matter, you know the hardest part about this is getting the network traffic to the device in the first place. How much are network taps? A lot, right? They can be obscenely expensive. And this is where my friends over at Dualcomm, and I should mention I am not sponsored by these guys, I'm just a very satisfied customer. I've deployed these in dozens of organizations, and I have never had a failure. I have never had a failure. They have a 10 gig tap for $700. That is a rounding error in most enterprise budgets. For most of the SMB budgets, they don't even need 10 gig, all right? But if you're future-proofing, if you need the 1 gig, I want to say it's in the $249, $299 range, right? So again, it's not nothing, but it really is well within the reach of most businesses. And most SMBs and SMEs, right, we're talking about doing north-south monitoring, right? So ingress, egress monitoring. Most of them don't have more than a gigabit connection anyway. Typically, the reason that I recommend doing the 10 gig is so that we can grow as their internet connection grows without replacing hardware, right? So, man, let's talk about event logs, right? Event logs. Why, in the year of our Lord, 2023, is the default size of the security event log on Windows still 20 freaking megabytes? I can't buy a laptop at Walmart with a smaller than 256 gigabyte SSD. And that's the $199 special. That's the one you give your kid when they're like, you know, the 5-year-old, when they're like, Dad, I want a computer. And you know they're going to break it. And you go grab. You have drive space. You have drive space. Now, look, I'm not talking about now configure the logs and send them to a SIEM. Hey, folks, let's be real, right? Most SMBs can't handle a SIEM anyway. And to the extent that you try to sell them one, I'm going to come in most cases and slap you upside the head and say, stop that, right? Because while log retention is important, that log retention in many cases is best suited on the endpoint itself. Now, before someone comes in and says, but Jake, what if the threat actor gets on the machine and clears the event log? There is no such animal. Okay, technically they can clear the event log, but it is a circular log, right? And if you have forensic tools, you can go back and see the cleared event log entries anyway. So again, expand this, make it something obscene, right? 500 gigabytes, no, sorry, 500 gigabytes, that's what I meant. 500 megabytes is not at all outside of the norm here, not at all outside of the ideal. I like sysmon too. Sysmon is a lot for some SMBs to handle. I say consider here versus the you should go and deploy sysmon, because sysmon does have a performance impact on some low-grade, low-budget machines, which disproportionately we find at SMBs and SMEs. Now, I talk about event logs. Why do I have this thing over here, right? Because a few years back, I want to say 2017, 2018, something, I started getting some emails, and they're like, hey, we're trying to sign up some influencers and, doing some product marketing. And I'm like, oh, cool. And start looking, and it's like steel chainsaws and whatnot. And I'm like, I don't work with chainsaws. Steel chainsaws are awesome, but I don't work with chainsaws. Why are you contacting me? And like, well, you're one of the top-rated influencers. And I'm like, no, definitely not, right? And it turns out they were using some wonderful AI tool, right? This is why I'm positive, by the way, that Terminator Rise of the Machines not coming to us anytime soon. They were using some wonderful AI tool that was looking for people that were getting great social media engagement around logging. Hand to heaven, I had this company come after me trying to get me to do, product marketing, thinking that I was talking about forestry services, which is mind-blowing to me, but hey, here we are, right? So, by the way, if you haven't noticed the third arm yet, you won't be able to not see it the second you see it, right? This is by far the best AI-generated image I have in the deck, by far. Okay, so look, SMBs and SMEs typically don't have DLP software, right? To the extent that, again, you try to go sell that to an SMB or an SME, you and I are probably going to have some words, right? Now, by the way, I should note here the one counterexample to all of this, or one counterpoint, I guess. If you're working with an SMB that has a contractual requirement, meaning they don't win the contract without DLP, and this is some cornerstone contract that's going to bring all kinds of money into the organization, that's situational, right? Awesome. In that case, by all means, deploy the minimum viable DLP to check the box, right? Yeah, I just said check the box as a security professional. Yeah, I feel dirty, but that's the reality of business, right? Minimum viable DLP to check the box. But the reality is in most cases, right, they aren't going to have DLP. And one of the big questions that comes up, particularly in insider threat investigations, is, well, did they just print it out? And so if you turn on the free print server operational logging in Windows, you get a full log of the user who printed a job, the file name they printed, the printer it went to, and the number of pages printed. And bonus, this works even when they print to PDF, right? Which is pretty cool, as it turns out. It's this awesome, free, untapped, but not on by default, right? Not on by default logging. Oh, by the way, I think the retention on this is like 1 megabyte, so you should turn that up as well, all right? Jeff, do you know, by the way? You nodded like you know. I'm not. Oh, okay. You're just, okay, good to go. I was like, yeah. Anyway, so, okay. Let's talk about security monitoring. Don't do it yourself, period. If you're in an SMB or an SME space, just like EDR, this is practically table stakes. You want to go and work with someone else who is going to monitor for you. Now, I recognize that a lot of times these MSSPs come back with these big ticket proposals, and they're way too expensive, and that's fine. If you are unfortunately in the position where that's you can't afford the security monitoring, right? What do? You have to be abundantly clear with your stakeholders that you are not going to be able to catch attacks. The vast majority of attacks you are not going to be able to catch. Not because you're dumb, not because you don't have the skills. You either lack the telemetry, right, the data to be able to see the attacks, the time, or in most cases, both, right? And so once you're clear with stakeholders that you can't catch these attacks, typically, in my experience, money opens up, or Alternatively, budget opens up, or in some cases, you find out who your stakeholders really are and begin looking for another job at some place that will treat you right. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about disabling USB rights. The reality here is, again, back to DLP. The most common data loss, or the most common source of data loss for SMBs, is an employee walking out with all of the data. And I mean like all of the data. I don't want to get too generational here, but I see a lot of older folks in the room, and I want to make sure that you're aware of this as you're consulting with SMBs, SMEs, heck, consulting with anyone. By the way, Gen Z folks in the room, and even to a lesser extent millennials, please don't get ticked with me. This is just it's a generational thing. A lot of Gen Z folks feel like the work that they have done at an employer is all theirs. The work product belongs to them. I've talked to a number of these folks, right, after they have taken data that belongs to their employer out of the network, aka stolen the data, right? After they have stolen the data, and they're just like, no, I didn't do anything wrong. I made that. I'm like, well, they paid you to make it, and per the contract, the employment agreement that you signed that legally bound you to, anyway, and they still don't get it. And so this is a thing you have to be aware of, right? Is that in a large number of cases, and these people do not consider themselves insider threats. When they go to leave an SMB, they download the whole CRM, right? The whole customer relationship management database. They just download it and they're like, okay, cool. I developed all those contacts. That's like, again, that's not yours to take. You want to nip this in the bud, right? By removing the ability to use USBs, period. You can do this through GPO. It's easy. It's one click, right? I'd also recommend in most cases removing the ability to execute as well. Heck, you could just disable all USB mass storage, and then you will quickly identify, by the way, where you have process issues that rely on USB mass storage, because people will come to you and say, hey, I need you to enable this, and then you can find out why, and yeah, it's a scream test. With that, let's move on to the hard part, patching. Man, patching is wicked, wicked difficult. Hybrid and remote workers complicate this ridiculously, because for a lot of our patching solutions, unfortunately, our employees need to be on network, right? They need to be on network in order to get the patches. Again, a lot of our remote and hybrid workers are not. I am an absolute believer in Automox and PDQ, right? Pick one of the solutions or pick a competitor. I don't care, right? But again, there are very few solutions or very few problems, that you can buy your way out of. This happens to be one of them, right? And so these are very, very cheap, very, very cheap, and they handle the third-party patching for you. So you're not trying to go and build the MSIs and build the deployment packages. And again, remember, you don't have the resources to do this. I've deployed Automox now in about, maybe 10 or 11 organizations, PDQ in 3 or 4, and in every case, we have not only driven up third-party patch compliance, also Windows patch compliance too, but very specifically our third-party app patch compliance. But that's not really the cool part. The cool part is all the time savings that we get back, the time we are returning to the system admins, where they are then doing other things that are helping our security. And so I'd almost buy it. I'd pay for that, actually, just for the time savings, getting that back to the system admins. It's almost like we're getting the third-party patching at that point for free. Ooh, CSPMs, all right? So CloudSploit, and I know everybody's got their own CSPM. Ooh, CSPMs are obscenely expensive. Commercial CSPMs need to come down in price because they are they're abusively expensive, right? And so there are a number of open source that are out there. I happen to like CloudSploit from Aquasec. Pick yours, whatever. But I'm going to offer a really, really deeply unpopular opinion. The vast majority of SMBs should not be in the cloud. should not be in the cloud. I know those are fighting words, right? CSPMs exist because we are deploying assets in the public cloud. We now have a brand new attack surface that we need to audit and manage. Now, I know all about the shared responsibility model, and I know I'm going to get a bunch of hate around this, right? Here you go, Jeff. Right? There you go. Yeah, so you can go post the flame thing there, right? But alas, the flame tweet. But alas, very seriously, right? Most SMBs don't really have the resources to configure cloud assets appropriately. We're adding now, while we are pulling away some complexity, we're adding orders of magnitude more, and complexity ends up being the enemy of security. Now, again, some folks that are like in high-tech organization or service providers, like you're an SMB who is themselves like a SaaS service provider, this does not apply to you. You were probably built in the cloud. Your engineers eat, breathe, live, eat, sleep, whatever, Kubernetes, right? Again, this is not for you, right? But for your random SMB who's told, well, you're more secure in the cloud. And I have folks asking me this, right? Where they're like, yeah, I saw the Microsoft, CEO testifying in front of Congress after the SolarWinds event. And he said, hey, the cloud's more secure. And if you'd only been in the cloud, the SolarWinds Orion attack wouldn't have happened to you. Which I guess is technically true, because you would have no reason to run SolarWinds Orion in Azure. But they leave that part out, right? And so you've got these SMB leaders coming back and asking, hey, what do they mean by this? Right? So again, a bit confusing for them. Let's talk about offline backups. I am big on budget offline backups. And you can do this with two in a minimal security or minimal configuration, but 3 in a full configuration network attached storage devices. You probably have one online. Despite my recommendations, you probably have a network attached storage device already in your network. And you can sync it to a second one and then pull that puppy offline and swap in the next unit, and then it'll sync again, and then you can swap in the next unit. So at any given time, one of them is physically disconnected from the network. This is awesome from a ransomware perspective, because the threat actor can't encrypt what's not on the network. Now, granted, from a process perspective, this is, it's not ideal. You are physically plugging and unplugging cables, right? But from a budget perspective, it's wicked easy. I looked this morning, thinking about from an SMB standpoint, how much would this cost to implement? And I thought about some of the SMBs that I'm doing business with recently, and they're storing somewhere in the neighborhood of, call it 10 to 15 terabytes online. And so I say online, on their network attached storage units or their file servers or what have you. And kind of stepped back and thought, okay, backups get compressed a bit, what have you. But I looked for some 24 terabyte network attached storage units, right? And I can get 24 terabytes, the NAS unit, the drives, everything for under $2K. So buying 3 of these so that I always have an offline backup solution costs $6,000, right? Which again, we're back down into rounding error territory, at least for larger organizations. Even for most SMBs, this is cheap insurance for ransomware. I should also mention, by the way, that backups will not save you from ransomware. Anyone who tells you otherwise has not been through a ransomware event, right? And then SaaS. Now, I know a minute ago I said you shouldn't be in the cloud. What I said was you shouldn't be running your own cloud infrastructure. This is another one that I run up with SMBs where they're like, oh yeah, so there's this open source project that does some of our calendar management integrations, so we're not paying for Calendly, or we're not paying for this, or we're not paying for that. Holy goodness. First off, you don't have enough system admins to deal with this, right? The build versus buy choice here is obvious, right? But when you start thinking about the labor and the inevitable downtime, because none of this stuff always works anyway, right? Yikes. SaaS wherever you can do it, right? SaaS wherever you can do it. That's one of the first things I do with SMBs as well, right? After we checked off some of these other boxes, is we look at what are you running on-prem that you can get rid of. And even if it's a little bit more expensive, and I say get rid of, I mean move to SaaS. Even if the SaaS component is a little bit more expensive, I'm still there 100%. right? Because again, we typically see the benefit over time. The little bit more expensive, often, unfortunately, right, is including things like, or excuse me, neglecting things like having to administer the server and, again, dealing with the downtime and you name it. So I'll wrap up here with a couple of notes about things that I consider absolutely off limits for SMBs. Let's start with managed threat hunting. And if you're looking there and you see the air quotes or the quotes, there's a reason for that. It is extremely difficult to threat hunt in someone else's environment. Well, that depends on how you're talking about threat hunt. I'm not going to name any specific vendors, but if you are procuring managed threat hunt services from a vendor who also has an EDR, who also sells you an EDR, they are only, in the vast majority of cases, and I have worked with several behind the scenes, they are front-running the indicators that you will get later that week. I'm not saying that's not valuable. I'm just saying that it's wicked expensive and also not what they describe that you're paying for. Again, won't be naming any vendors here, right? But I can tell you that a major vendor, right? We'll call it top 5, right? Has a ridiculous customer to analyst ratio where you are getting somewhere around, on a good week, 2-ish, 3-ish hours a week of that analyst threat hunt time. Is that great? I don't know. Depends on your situation. It's certainly not what you were sold, right? So managed threat hunt, off the table, right? Now again, there are companies that do managed threat hunting extremely well. How will you know who they are? Because they'll want to get to know your environment. They'll want to sit down with you and work with you, and you can imagine that these will be, I don't know, more expensive and out of the reach of SMBs. CTI feeds. If you work in cyber threat intelligence and you go and sell a small, medium business a CTI feed or dark web monitoring, I will use some of my many frequent flyer miles to come to your location and we will have words. I don't like to use the F word a lot, but I will call you a fraud, an absolute fraud, right? Phishing testing is another one, right? Phishing testing, again, I'm not saying this doesn't have value. Well, whatever. That's another talk for another day. But at a small, medium business level, it doesn't. Commercial security awareness training, right? Go to YouTube. YouTube has lots of free content. And it's just as good or bad or useless or just as whatever as everything else, right? By the way, commercial security awareness companies, I've heard the pitch when I've seen folks ask, well, what about the free content? And they're just like, ours is so much better. We have much better outcomes than the free training. Ask them for the data. They don't have it. Actually, forget about the better outcomes. Ask them for the data showing that security awareness changes the number of incidents that you have. Ooh, that's tough, right? Yeah, because you'd think if they had it, that would be like the front page of every time you landed on the website. They'd be showing you how well it works. Again, fancy ransomware prevention tools. Have you ever seen or read the fine print, right, where there are the $5 million ransomware guarantee, just deploy our product? Because the fine print, oh, buddy, is it fine, right? If you think you're getting that $5 million, I have some awesome oceanfront property in Arizona I am ready to sell you at a discount. Zero trust solutions, right? Zero trust. Again, not suitable for SMBs and SMEs. AI penetration testing, again, yet another thing there, and I'm not even getting into that whole hornet's nest of nastiness. And then finally, commercial PAM solutions. This is one that I keep seeing folks come to, yeah, I'm not going to name it. I was getting ready to name a vendor finally. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to be good today. But what's that? Oh, no, not doing that either. I got to, what does the name rhyme with? And I can't do it. But listen, PAM solutions are fantastic. In fact, I was just on a webcast a couple of weeks ago with a PAM vendor where I said the words, PAM is literally table stakes in modern security, because it is. But again, I'm going to be real. My small, medium businesses can barely admin their way out of a paper bag in a lot of cases. They can't take the added complexity of PAM, even if they can afford it. All right? And so again, we have to be real about who we're protecting and what we're protecting. So I'll wrap up with, again, just to close up here, SMB security is not about adapting best practices that work for the larger orgs. I hear some very smart people who I otherwise respect a lot make this claim that, again, you need to adapt the practices and try and scale them down, and it's not about that. You start scaling stuff down when you've got a 90% solution, right? We're trying to shave that top 10% off. We're not doing this, right? This is like quadruple amputation plus, right? So I want to start with realistic security goals and adopt solutions that meet those goals. And you have to meet SMBs where they are, right? Not where they'd be with an infinite budget. Again, we're here solving for X, right? It's how do we provide the best security for an SMB? And finally, for the consultant folks in the room here, I'll close by noting that you can't help everybody. Sometimes there is no solve for X. Given the constraints on the right side of the equation, there is no set of security that makes sense for that organization. When that's the case, do the right thing and tell them you're not doing anybody, especially yourself, any favors, right? But by not being real with a client. Appreciate your time, folks. Thank you so much.
Another mic on the podium there. They're supposed to. Thank you, Jake. Great talk. We just realized the other mic is missing somewhere. I don't know. We'll find it. So does anybody have any questions for Jake before he bails? Yes, sir.
So how do you square, if you're talking to an executive for a small, medium business, and in one breath you say, get off of Exchange, get into the cloud, this is important, don't do on-prem, but at the same time, don't put your infrastructure into the cloud. If putting myself in an executive position, I'm like, what the hell did you just say to me? Like, which one is the way? What's your explanation to them if they say, explain that?
That's a fantastic question. And here's where I have to educate that executive about the difference between SaaS and running infrastructure, right? So SaaS, because we think about, and we can argue about nomenclature that maybe Microsoft 365 is platform as a service, but at the end of the day, I'm looking to move them into SaaS, right? Whereas them managing their own infrastructure is a completely different beast. Also, the second thing I note there is Exchange is a special case. It is a special case where I can't get anything close to comparable security on-prem because Microsoft has semi-officially abandoned it.
Excellent. I'll switch mics. All right, yeah, we found the other mic. Yeah, follow up.
All right. One quick follow-up and I'll shut up. So what do you define then to that executive as infrastructure versus, mail and shit like that?
Yeah, so if you're trying to run a database, so manage database services or VM or containers or Kubernetes cluster or you name it, that's all infrastructure, right? So basically, if you have any system administration responsibilities, if there's a DBA, if it requires PowerShell or command line, requires PowerShell or, not saying you can't do good PowerShell or command line, if it requires it, it's infrastructure. I'm not saying that definitely is a universal definition, but it is infrastructure at that point.
All right, thanks. We have one question over here from Jeff.
Jeff.
Do you have strong opinions on SMBs running span ports as opposed to hardline taps if they happen to have a switch already that supports it?
Yeah, so on the span port versus hardware tap, do I have strong opinions about that? If you couldn't afford a tap, although the dual-com taps are so cheap that shouldn't be the argument, don't let perfect stand in the way of better, right? So span port is better. Depending on how that switch is configured, we may not be getting full traffic. As you well know, right? We may be dropping traffic on the span port that we'd see on the tap, right? So.
All right, thanks very much. Good question. I think we're actually out of time at this point. Thank you, Jake. Big round of applause. Thanks for attending, everybody.
Oh, and by the way, I'll publish these slides on my GitHub, and if you follow me on Twitter, I'll tweet those out here in a bit. So, yeah, if anybody wanted the slides.